Now before we start developing our apps through Flutter, it is very important for us to understand some of the core concepts of Dart. So in this lesson, we will be understanding what are functions in Dart, data types, variables, and so on. So I want you to navigate into this website dartpad.dev. It is an online editor for Dart code. It will make our testing easier. So now I want you to clear all the contents that are in your Dartpad so that we can start from the scratch. So now let's get started by understanding functions in Dart. So let me write a quick comment over here. So we'll be learning about functions in Dart first. Now if you are new to programming, anything that starts with double forward slashes is a comment. It does not execute in our code. It is solely for the purpose of making our code easier to read, right? So first we'll be learning about functions in Dart. So what are functions in Dart or any other programming language? Functions are the collection of logic. Everything that your app does, whether it be front end or back end, the functions contains the logic of your app. So how do you create a function in Dart? So if I want to create a function that adds two numbers, then this is how I create function in Dart. So I start by giving my function a name. So let my function name be adder. So this function will add two numbers and give me the result. So in function, the first thing is the function name. So our function name is adder, and then we will have in parenthesis, this is a function caller, or this is how you write in function, and then we have the curly braces, opening and closing curly braces, and inside of this is the function body. So first the function name, then the parenthesis, and then the curly braces, inside of which we will be writing the logic of our function. So inside of it I'll be writing print. Now by this print statement we can see the output in the console. So I want to add two numbers, so 2 plus 3, right? And everything in Dart will end with a semicolon. It does not apply to the function though, but in every part of the code you will be seeing the semicolon that splits the line. Alright, so if I click at run, you will get an error over here, and the error says that there is no main method found. Now in Dart, the main entry point of function or executing any Dart code is the main functions. So I want you to create a main function over here. So the name of the function will be main, and then the parenthesis, and then inside of it will be the function body, right? Now let me copy this and then paste it over here. Now if I run this code, you can see that I get an output of 5. Now instead of directly printing this output in our main function, I want this main function to call this adder function, and this adder function will print this output. So what I can do is, how can I call another function, is I can simply write the function name and then the parenthesis. And this is how you call another function in Dart. Now if I click at run, then you can see I'll get the same output 5. If I replace it with 2, then I'll be getting the result 4. Now what is happening here is this Dartpad is executing this main function directly, and then this is calling our adder function, and then this adder function is executing on demand. Now this is a basic example of Dart functions. There are many more things that you can do with Dart function, and I'll be coming back to it later. For now, let's move to another core concept, that is variables in Dart. So how do you create variables in Dart, or what are variables actually? So if you look into this adder function, you can see that I have hard coded these numbers over here in our print function, right? So instead of doing so, it will be better if I create a variable and then add these two variables. So for creating a variable, let me write a quick comment, right? So how do you create a variable in Dart? So for creating a variable, you must start with the keyword var, var meaning the variable. So var a equals to number 2. So we are assigning this 2 value to variable a. And let's create another variable, variable b equals to 2. Now instead of hard coding this 2 plus 2 over here, I can simply replace this with a plus b. Now if I change this, and if I run this code, so you can see the results over here. And this time we are not adding the hard-coded values. Instead we are creating a variable and then adding these variables over here. A better approach for this is to create another variable called sum, in which we will be adding this a plus b variable, and then we will be sending this sum in our print statement. So if I run this, I'll be getting the same output, number 7 over here. But this time we are creating another variable and storing the value over here. Now if you look into our function adder, you can see that no matter how many times we call this adder from here, we will always get the same output. So what can be done to make our function a little bit dynamic? So now we'll be learning about passing arguments in functions. So let me show you how we can pass argument in function to make our function dynamic. So instead of hard coding these variables over here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide arguments in the function inside this parenthesis. So a comma b. So I'll be removing this. So now as you can see here, I'm getting an error in our main function where we are calling this error function, and the error that we are facing is two positional argument expected by the error but found 0. So when we declare our arguments in this manner, we should provide the value of these arguments in the function that we are calling. So we should be writing what is the value of a and value of b in this function where we are trying to call this error function. So let me write 2, 4. Now if I run this function, then this 2 and 4 will be passed to a and b respectively, and then this sum will add these variables, and then the print will output our sum. So I get the result 6. Now there is a better way to pass argument into the function. Instead of just writing the variable name in the arguments, what we can do is we can surround it by curly braces. Now by doing so, whenever we'll call this function, we need to define the name of this variable as well. So a and colon the value, and then b colon the value. So by doing this, we can make our code more readable and then easier to maintain. And this is a basic example of how functions calling works in Dart. Obviously there is more to learn, and we'll be learning that eventually when our course proceeds. So I'll see you at the next lesson. In this lesson, we'll be learning about data types in Dart. It is another core concept of Dart that we need to understand. So navigate into dartpad.dev, clear all the content so we can start from the scratch. In previous lesson, we learned how we can create a variable in Dart. So by using the var keyword, let's create a variable. So var cost of book equals to 1000. Now when you are creating a variable name, make sure that you do not use any special characters in variable name. So while naming a function or a variable, make sure you are not using special characters like space, question mark, semicolon, and so on, right? And in Dart, it is recommended that you use camel case for functions and variables. Camel case meaning that some of the words will be of lowercase and the starting of some words will be of uppercase. So in this variable, you can see that cost is of lowercase and this of is another word. So O is of uppercase and then this book is of uppercase. This is called a camel case in programming language. Now if you look at this cost of book variable closely, you can see that this value of cost of book is a number, right? So instead of using this bar, we can simply use number. And the reason for us using the nom keyword instead of var keyword is that Dart have different types of data types, and it is always a good practice to use the correct data types for your variable. Not only it is a good practice, it will help us write our code faster, because when you are using an IDE like Visual Studio Code and developing a real app, our IDE will provide suggestions based on those data types. And by providing the correct data type, we are less likely to make type error when we are handling a large project. Now how can a type error occur? I'll show you that shortly. So first let's look at the data types that Flutter can provide us. The first one being the nom. Nom will hold the data for the numbers. This nom can also be split into integer and double. Say int int age. This will hold a number like a simple number without any decimals. If you want decimal, then you can use double. And the commonly used data type is an string. So string, let's use camel case in this. So this is of string type. In most programming languages, this string will be surrounded by quotes. Another commonly used type is a boolean type. So bool, which stands for boolean, and this boolean will hold the data for either true or false. So is logged in can be either true or it can be false, but it will not hold any data except true and false, right? So these are commonly used. Another commonly used data type is a dynamic data type. This dynamic data type can hold any type of data, say dummy. It can be either a number, it can be a string, it can be true and false, a boolean, and everything. This dynamic will hold basically any type of data. It's basically like using a var keyword, and by using dynamic we cannot leverage the full benefit of type check. So we will not be using this data type. Instead we will be using the appropriate data types in our Dart code. Now there are two other important data types in Dart: list and map, but I will not be explaining this in this lesson because they are a little bit complex than these primitive types of data, right? And I will be explaining that in our lessons to come. Now let me show you what are the advantages of using these data types in Dart and how type check works. So let me clear this all and let me create a function. So let's create a main entry point for our code, and inside of this will be our logic. Let me create another function as well. So this will be an adder function, and this adder function will expect two arguments, a and b, and inside of this there will be a calculation. So var sum equals to a plus b, and then we'll be printing sum over here, right? And now we'll be calling this adder function from here. So if I run this code, I'll get a response of 2. But as we learned earlier, instead of just passing the variable name over here, we can wrap this with curly braces and we can use the name over here in the function we are calling, so our code becomes more readable, right? This is basically what we had learned in the previous lesson. Now what if instead of passing a number in the a variable, I pass an string? So if I execute this code, I'll be getting an type error, meaning that my code is trying to add two variables, but one of those variable is an string, and string and number cannot be added. So this resulted in crash of our app, right? So how can we prevent this type error from occurring? So the best way for this to do is to leverage the full capacity of type checker of Dart. And how can we do so? Is by providing the data type of variables. So let me show you how this can be done. So now instead of writing the string, let me provide a number over here so that everything runs fine, right? Now instead of just declaring the variable name over here, we will be providing the data type for that variable. So a is of data type number, so right before this a we will be writing number and then space and the variable name. And as it is required for the computation, we will be writing the required keyword in front of this data type. So required number a, and we will do the same for b, required number b. Now our adder function will only accept the arguments if a is of number and b is of number. Now if I press at run, then everything will execute just fine, right? Now let me try changing this to an string. Now as I am typing this string in my a value, I have already got an error before even running my code. So this error that was triggered is called an type check error, and this type check error is triggered by my editor as I was typing the wrong arguments, right? I did not have to wait for my code to compile and to see the error. I got the error as I was typing, and now I can catch all the errors as I type and I can fix them so that my app do not have to crash in the future, right? So this data check is one of the most important features of Dart. So we need to leverage that by using the correct data types. Now in the next lesson, we will be learning about return types in Dart. I'll see you there. In the previous lesson, we learned about data types in Dart. Now in this lesson, we will be understanding another core concept of Dart, and that is return types. Return types are used with functions and they determine what type of data will be returned by the function. So let's get started by creating a main function that will be our entry point. So main function, and inside of this function we will be calculating the square of a number. So let me create another function as well. So calculate square. So now this calculate square will expect a variable which is of number type. So required number type of data, and then the num data be my variable name. So now for calculating the square, we need to multiply this number twice. So let me create a variable. So var results equals to num data into num data. right? Now if we multiply this number with the same number, then we will be getting the result, and the result will be of number type. So we are safe to write number over here instead of var, because we will be using the appropriate data types from now on. So num results. Now instead of just printing this output, I want to return this output from my function. So what I need to do is return, use the return keyword, and then the thing that you want to return. So I'll be returning the results. Now whenever any other function calls this calculate square function, then the response of this function or the output will be the results. Now in this function you can see that we are returning a number type, right? So we can simply provide return type of this function as number. Now what this return type does is that it ensures that the return value of this function is always a number. So if I try to replace this with string, then I can only return the string and not the number. So I am getting an error. A num can be returned from a function calculate square because it is of return type string. So let me replace this string with a number and everything will be fine. So now we will be calling this calculate square function from the main function. So let's print over here. So the square result is, and then here will be the result, right? Now we need to call this calculate square function from this main function, and this return type is number, right? So we will be providing the data type num, and then the results, and this result we can access from calculate square. So calculate square, and then it will be expecting a number. So num data is 2, right? Now by doing so, this function is called, and the value that it returns will be saved into our variable results. We can also change this, say results data. It doesn't matter because we are only saving the variable value. So now let me end this with semicolon as well. And now we need to provide this results data in our print statement. So I can do that simply by copying this and using it over here. Now if I run this code, you can see that I'll be getting an output, but our results data is not being replaced by this result data. So if you want to provide dynamic data in dart string, then you need to use this $sign right before the variable. So now if I run this, I'll be getting the square result is 4. So this is how we use return types in our function. Now whenever we write any function, we need to always use the return type. But as you can see in this main function, we are not returning anything. So what type of return type can you use in this type of function? So we can simply use void. Void meaning that this function will return nothing, right? Void means nothing, so this function is not returning anything. Now if I try to return some data, then I will be getting an error saying that this main function is of return type void, but I am returning of type string, so I am getting an error. So if you are not returning anything, then you are returning a void, meaning nothing, right? So whenever we write a function, we provide return types to them. So you can leverage the full capacity of data type or type checks in Dart. So I'll see you at the next lesson. In previous lessons, we learned some of the basic concept of Dart like Dart function, data types, variable, return types, and so on. Now it's time that we move further and understand some of the advanced concepts in Dart, and they are objects and classes. So what are objects and classes and how they impact our development in Flutter? Now before we move further, I want you to understand that Dart is an object-oriented programming, and it means that we rely heavily on objects while we code on Dart. So what are objects exactly? Now in Dart, basically everything is an object. In previous lesson, we learned about variables, right? So var book name equals to a book. So this is a primitive type of object. We learned about functions. So some function. So this function is also regarded as a first class object in Dart. So these are the primitive types. Not only this var keyword, but boolean, string, integer, double, everything in Dart is a primitive data type or primitive type objects. Now this function is a first class object. But when we talk about objects in Dart, we mainly refer to classes. So when I refer to objects, I basically mean classes and not these variables or functions. These are primitive types, so we'll not be talking about them in the object section. So let's clear that up. And now let's get to the main deal, classes. So what are classes in Dart? So you can directly refer these classes as an objects in Dart. So instead of saying classes, we'll just refer it by objects, right? So for understanding it better, let's take an example of physical world. So everything that you see around you are objects. So a car can be an object, a bike can be an object, a laptop can be an object. So basically everything that exists in physical world is an object. Now these objects have their own properties. Like if you look into this car properties, the car can have a color. Color can be a red color, blue color, green, and so on. And same goes with other objects as well. And these objects can have their own functionalities. Like a car can drive, a bike can drive, a laptop can perform calculations, and so on. So object is something that has properties and that have some functionalities. And the same thing is true with classes or objects in Dart as well. So let's get started by creating a bike object in Dart. So in Dart, for creating a class, you must use the keyword class. So class and then the class name. And the class name starts with an uppercase. So we are creating a class for bike, or we are creating a bike object. So bike. And we do not call parentheses like so in class, but we will have in curly braces. And inside of these brackets will be the methods and properties of the bike. So a class can have properties and methods. So what are properties and methods in class? So if you take an example of bike, a property of a bike can be the color of bike, right? So let's create a color property. So string color equals to red. This signifies that bike is of red color. Now we can have multiple properties. So number cc equals to this bike is of 155 cc. So it can have red color and it can have cubic capacity or cc of 155. So these are the properties of this bike object. So as you can see, the variables if used inside of the class are the properties of a class, right? So what are methods? So methods are the functionality of this bike. So main functionality of bike is it can take us from one place to another, right? So we can write void ride bike. Now this is the method of bike. There can be multiple methods, but we are talking about only one method for now, and it's called ride bike. And inside of the ride bike, that can be an actual logic of riding a bike, like starting an engine, right? Moving forward, and so on, right? So functions, if used inside of the classes, are called methods. So basically objects in Dart can be defined as the classes that has their own properties and methods. So let me print a statement here. So print bike is moving forward, right? So now let's try calling this ride bike functionalities that is inside of this bike class. So for that we will be needing our entry point. So let me clear this up. And void main, our entry point, and from inside of this main function we will be accessing this bike object and we will be executing this ride back functionality or method of this object. So for accessing this bike object, we need to initialize this object first, and this is how you do it. So let's create a variable. So var, a variable name get bike, and you can initialize or access this bike by using the new keyword. So we are initiating new class of this bike object. So new and then bike and then parentheses. By doing so, we are creating a new instance of this bike so we can get all the methods and properties of this bike object. Now you can simply access this ride back functionality or ride back method of this object by using get bike, our variable, and then dot ride bike, right? And if I run this code, you can see that our main function has accessed the method of this bike object. So bike is moving forward, which is triggered by this ride back method. Now instead of just writing bike is moving forward, let's say a color, meaning red bike of CC is moving forward. So if I run this now, you can see that red bike of 155cc is moving forward. Now you can also change the properties by accessing the object. For instance, if I want to change the cc of this bike, I can simply write get bike.cc equals to 150, right? Now if I run this code, you can see that red bike of 150cc is moving forward. I can also change the color. So get bike.color equals to blue. Now if I run this code, I can see blue bike of 150cc is moving forward. Now if I want to create another bike, I can simply copy this, paste it and change like get another bike. Now copy this, change this as well, and then let it be green and of 10cc. And if I click it run, you can see that I have created two instances of this class. It's like creating two different bikes using a same bike and riding it differently, right? This is one of the main advantages of using object-oriented programming, is that you can use, create, destroy objects and then you can reuse them time and again. So now let's analyze our code and see what's exactly happening here. For that, let me clear this second bike. Now if you look at this first line, you can see that we are creating a new instance of this bike object. Our new bike has been created using the color red and 155cc, and later on we change the color to blue and the cc to 150, and then this write back function has been triggered, which is showing our updated properties, right? So as you can see, we have only two properties in our bike object, so it is not much of a trouble to change properties in this way. But imagine having hundreds and thousands of properties, and changing property in this manner will be a bit of a hassle, right? So what we can do is, instead of changing color and cc after the bike has been created, we can simply pass this color and cc while creating a bike, so that we do not have to change these properties later in our code. So how can this be done? How can an object be created? By taking values, so that we do not have to change values in the runtime. So this is where the constructor of a class comes into play. So what constructor does in our class is, it takes the values and it will construct the class for us using the predefined values. So we do not have to change the properties time and again. We can pass the properties over here, so that when a class is created, it is created with an updated value. So how can we create constructor? So let's start building a constructor. So now that we will have dynamic values for color and cc, let's remove this and then simply write string color, because we will be needing the color, and then number cc. So as I have removed this value of color and cc, I am getting an error saying that this field are not initialized yet. And now we need to instruct our dart code that these values will be given us by the constructor. So let's create a constructor, and constructor always starts with the class name. So class name is bike, so bike, and inside of it will be the values that is expected by the constructor. So color and cc, but instead of writing just color and cc, we need to use this dot keyword in front of this variable, so that it can understand that we are trying to access the variable inside of this class. So this dot color and this dot cc. Now let's close this, and this is how you create a constructor. Now as I have created a constructor, I am getting an error over here saying that a constructor is expecting two variables to be passed, color and cc, but we are not passing any. So let's remove this line, or simply write blue over here being the color and then cc being 65, right? Now we can remove this. Now if I run this code, you can see that my blue bike of 65cc is moving forward. Now I do not need to change the properties once my class or object has been initialized. It's like passing arguments into the function that we learned before, but for the class, right? Now while passing the arguments, to make it easier for us to read, we wrapped this arguments by curly braces, right? So let's wrap this so it will be easier to read. So let's wrap this, and this will be a required field. So required and also required, and then instead of passing variables like this, what we can do is we can provide the color pink and then cc be 290, and this is obviously making our code easier to read, and we can figure out what type of arguments are being passed while the class is being constructed, right? Now if I run this, I can see the updated results of pink bike of 290 cc is moving forward. So when you are working with classes, you might sometime need to work with optional parameters. So let me create a variable over here, string bike number. So when I want to create a new bike, sometime I might not have this bike number value that I can pass into the constructor while creating a new bike class. Alright. So instead of initializing this variable on constructor using required keyword, I'm gonna just initialize it with this.bike number. Alright. But I'll get an error here saying that this value must be initialized. Now, if I make this a required property by using this required keyword, it does solve the issue, but then I have to pass this variable whenever I want to create a new bike, right? And as I said earlier, I always do not have this value. So what I can do now is to remove this required keyword from here and use the question mark right after the data type of a variable. What this does is that it converts this variable into an optional variable or optional property, alright? So this value can hold either the string or the null value. So this means that this string bike number is now an optional parameter. We can either pass it or we are free to not pass this variable while creating a new class. So let me go ahead and try to print this variable over here. So $bike number, alright. So now if I run this code, here you can see that I am getting this null value in this bike number, because while creating this bike instance or creating this new bike from this class, in constructor we are not passing this bike number, right? But if I pass this bike number here and run this code now, so here you can see that I have this bike number over here. So by using this question mark, you can turn any variable into an optional variable, alright? And you can use this optional parameter in function as well. So let me create a new function, void a dummy function, and here I'll be keeping a required parameter. So required string, and then the variable name will be something. So now whenever I call this a dummy function, so let me call here, I need to pass this something value over here, alright? And now let me create another variable over here, the optional data, alright? And I want this to be an optional variable, so I can use this question mark over here, and I am now free to choose whether to send this variable or not. And now let me clear everything. So this is how you work with objects and classes in Dart. Now in the next lesson, we will be learning about extending a class, which is very important concept for Flutter app development. So I'll see you at the next lesson. In the previous lesson, we learned about objects and classes in Dart. Now in this lesson, we will be learning a little bit advanced concept, and that is inheritance of class. So we'll be understanding what inheritance means and how we can inherit a class so we can create our own custom classes. So before we dive into the inheritance, let's create a class first with the knowledge we already have. So void main is our entry point, right? And we'll be creating a class bike. And this bike will have two parameters. So string, color, and number cc. And this will have a constructor required this.color and required this.cc, right? And inside of it there will be a function write. This will print forward. Now we need to initialize the class. So var my bike equals to new bike class, and then inside of it color red, and then cc be 100, right? Now my bike dot ride. Now if I run this code, you can see that the bike is moving forward. Now as we know from previous lesson, we do not use this var very often. So instead of writing this var, what we can do is we can provide the data type of bike. Bike meaning that this is an instance of a class, and while initializing a new class, you can use the class name as a data type. So this is what we have learned till now. Now it's time that we learn about inheritance. So inheritance is our way of creating a new class by taking the existing properties and method of another class. So why is this important and why we need to learn this? Now let me give you an example. Say in physical world you want to customize a bike. So what would be your approach? Would your approach be to create an engine from scratch or the tires from scratch? So creating a bike on your own from the scratch is almost impossible, right? So what you can do and what should be your approach is to take an existing bike and customize it in your own way so that you do not have to create everything from the scratch. The properties and the riding functionality of the bike is still there. You only need to customize a few things to make your own custom bike, right? And this is true for Dart classes or objects as well. You can inherit a class with their properties and method intact, and then you can customize a few things or everything in them so you can make your own custom class. So how can you do that? So in my Dart code, if I want to create a custom bike object using this bike class, then what I can do is write class keyword, same as I would create a new class. So class and the first letter will always be capital, so custom bike extends. Now extend is a keyword for inheritance, and the class it will extend is the bike class, so bike. Now when we extend a class, this custom bike already inherits all the properties and the method inside of this class. Now imagine you have thousands of properties and thousands of methods. If you want to create that from scratch, then it will take a lot of time. But if you extend this and inherit the class, then you can tap into all the methods and functionalities of another class. And here you can see that I am getting an error while trying to extend this custom bike from this bike class. And this is because this bike class already has two parameters that are required, right? So the thing to keep in mind is that if we are using constructor and some of the fields in constructor are of required in the parent class from where we are trying to inherit, then we also need a constructor in our custom class so that we can get all the required fields. So we can do that by using the constructor. So custom bike, the same name as the class name. This will be our constructor. And inside of this, we will be needing two fields. So required. And you can access this field of the parent by super, meaning the super class or the parent class, dot color. We will be needing the color. And required super.cc. And by doing so, we have successfully created a new class that extends the previous class, so we can tap into all the methods and properties of the previous class. Now instead of using this new bike, we can write custom bike, and we do not need to define this string color and this function over in our custom bike. This has already inherited from our bike class, so this mybike.ride will work fine from our custom bike as well, because we have inherited all the method and properties. Now by extending a class, you can not only tap into properties and method of another class, but you can also override the method. For instance, if you don't want this default method of the parent class in your custom class, then what you can do is you can simply write @override, meaning that I want to override some of the methods. And right below this you can write void ride, meaning that you are trying to override the ride method of the parent class. So instead of that, you write print this is over method. Now if you run this code, you can see that I've got a response of this is overridden method. We have successfully override the method of our parent class from our child class by using the override keyword. So this is how you inherit an existing class and create your own class or your own object, so that you do not have to write thousands of codes in your own class. And when we are developing our apps on Flutter, we will be using this many times. So I'll see you at the next lesson.